Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. The first time I heard someone calling my name from the woods, I was 9 years old. It was late summer, and my father had taken me camping somewhere in northern West Virginia. I do not remember the name of the campground anymore, but I remember the smell, wet leaves, campfire smoke, and that cold, earthy smell the mountains get after it rains. My father had gone down to the creek to fill our water bottles. I was sitting beside the fire, throwing small pieces of wood into the coals, when I heard him call me. Danny. I looked toward the trail. I could see the trees moving in the wind, but I could not see him. Danny. Same voice. Same distance. I started walking toward it. Then my father came back from the opposite direction. He was carrying the water bottles in one hand. He looked at me. Then he looked toward the trees. Who were you talking to? I told him I thought he had called me. He did not laugh. He did not even ask me to explain. He just grabbed my shoulder and told me something I have never forgotten. If you hear me calling you from the woods, make sure you can see me before you answer. I thought it was just something parents said to scare their kids into staying close to camp. I forgot about it eventually. Or at least, I thought I had. 27 years later, I was sitting alone beside an empty campsite in the Appalachian Mountains when someone called my name from the trees. Danny. This time, there was no one camping anywhere near me, and I knew exactly what my father had meant. The problem was that I had not thought about that night in years. Not really. I had remembered the camping trip sometimes, usually when someone mentioned West Virginia, or when I smelled wood smoke after rain, but the memory had always felt incomplete. Like an old photograph with the edges burned away. I remembered my father, the creek, the fire, the wet ground, and the voice. I remembered him telling me never to answer it. What I did not remember was why we had left the campground the next morning. I did not remember packing our things. I did not remember the drive home. I did not remember what happened after my father grabbed my shoulder. For most of my adult life, I assumed that was because I had been 9 years old and memories from that age were naturally unreliable. People forget things. Childhood becomes a collection of disconnected images, and eventually the details disappear. That was what I told myself. It was an easy explanation, and I had never had a reason to question it. Until the day I returned to those mountains. I was 36 years old when it happened. At the time, I was working as an independent property inspector, mostly for companies that needed someone to check remote cabins, hunting properties, and old recreational sites before they were sold or reopened. It was not exciting work, but it paid better than my previous job and gave me enough freedom that I could disappear for a few days without asking anyone for permission. That was exactly what I needed that fall. My marriage had ended 6 months earlier, and I was still trying to figure out what my life was supposed to look like afterward. I had moved into a small apartment outside Charleston, and most nights I came home to a place that felt too quiet. I started taking longer assignments because being alone in a car felt easier than being alone in my apartment. That was how I ended up accepting a job in the mountains. A private campground had been closed for several years after a series of complaints about flooding and structural damage. The owner wanted an independent inspection before reopening part of the property. There were 12 campsites, 2 maintenance buildings, an old shower house, and a narrow road that followed a creek through the valley. The owner told me the place was remote but not dangerous. He said the nearest town was about 40 minutes away. He said, there was no cell service once I passed the last ridge. None of that bothered me. I had spent enough time in remote properties that bad roads and weak signals were normal. The only thing that bothered me was the name of the campground. When he sent me the paperwork, I stared at it for several seconds before I understood why it looked familiar. It was the same campground where my father had taken me when I was 9. I almost called him. Then I remembered he had been dead for 11 years. I sat at my desk with the paperwork open in front of me, and tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. There were dozens of campgrounds in West Virginia. Some had probably been operating for decades. Names were reused. Roads were renamed. Properties changed owners. There was nothing strange about it. Still, I searched the address online. The map showed a narrow mountain road disappearing into a heavily wooded valley. The coordinates matched the location in my childhood memory more closely than I wanted them to. I told myself that was impossible. I accepted the assignment anyway. The drive took almost 4 hours. The farther I went, the less traffic I saw. The sky was gray when I left town, and by the time I reached the mountains, a thin rain had started. The kind of rain that barely looked like rain from inside the windshield. It covered the glass with a fine mist and made the road shine beneath the headlights. I passed an old gas station, then a closed diner, then a church with a small cemetery behind it. After that, there was almost nothing. Just trees, hills, and occasional mailboxes beside gravel driveways. I kept thinking about my father. I remembered the way his hand had felt around my shoulder that night. Strong, tense, almost painful. I remembered his face. That was the strange part. I had remembered him as angry, but now that I was older, I realized he had not been angry. He had been terrified. I could see it clearly now. His eyes had kept moving toward the trees while he talked to me. He had not looked at me once when he gave me the warning. He had been looking behind me. I had never understood that before. By the time I reached the turnoff for the campground, the rain had stopped. There was an old wooden sign beside the road, half covered by vines. The name had almost completely faded away. I had to get out of the car to read it. I stood there in the damp air and felt something inside me tighten. I knew this place. I did not remember the sign itself, but I remembered the shape of the road. I remembered the curve. I remembered the tall trees on both sides. I remembered a large gray rock near the entrance. It was still there. Older, covered with moss, but unmistakable. I sat in the car for several minutes before starting the engine again. I considered turning around. I even put the car into reverse. Then I thought about the money. I thought about my apartment. I thought about how ridiculous it would sound to cancel a professional inspection, because a mountain road reminded me of something from childhood. So I drove in. The campground appeared about 15 minutes later. There were 12 numbered sites arranged around a narrow loop. The road was covered with wet leaves, and several branches had fallen across the edges. The place looked abandoned, but not destroyed. Picnic tables were still there. Fire rings were still there. A few old wooden posts leaned beside the road. There were no campers, no cars, no people. I parked near the maintenance building and got out. The silence was immediate. It was not complete silence. I could hear the creek somewhere beyond the trees. I could hear water moving over rocks. I could hear wind high in the branches. But there were no birds, no insects, nothing moving close to me. I checked my phone. No signal. I expected that. I opened the inspection file and started walking around the property. The work was simple. Check the condition of the sites, inspect the drainage channels, photograph the buildings, record any structural problems, and leave before dark. I started at Site 1, then Site 2, then Site 3. Everything was ordinary. Damp wood, rusted metal, cracked concrete, old leaves packed into the corners of the fire rings. I reached Site 7 near 4 in the afternoon. I stopped there without knowing why. There was something familiar about it. The picnic table was old, but not as old as the others. I walked around it and noticed a small mark carved into the underside. A single letter. I brushed away the dirt with my fingers. Beneath the dirt was another mark, then another. They formed the beginning of a name. I could not make out the rest. I stood there for several seconds, trying to remember. Then I heard water moving somewhere beyond the trees. I looked toward the creek. Something about the sound made my stomach turn. I had heard that sound before. Not recently. Not in another place. Here when I was 9. I walked toward it before I could talk myself out of it. The trail was narrower than I remembered. Roots pushed through the mud, and wet leaves stuck to my boots. After about 100 yards, the trees opened slightly and I saw the creek. It was wider than it had been in my memory. Or maybe I had simply been smaller. I stood on the bank and looked across the water. Nothing moved. I remembered my father filling the bottles here. I remembered the sound of water against the rocks. I remembered sitting near the fire. Then I remembered the voice. Danny. I closed my eyes. For a moment I could almost hear it again. I opened them quickly. There was nobody across the creek. I turned around and started walking back. Halfway to the campsite, I noticed something lying beneath a tree. It was a blue plastic cup. I stopped. The cup was faded and dirty, but the shape was familiar. I picked it up. On the bottom was a name written in black marker. Ivan. I stared at it for a long time. I did not know anyone named Ivan. At least I did not think I did. I turned the cup over in my hands. There was a small crack along the rim. I remembered that crack. I did not know how I remembered it, but I did. Suddenly I saw a little boy sitting beside the fire. He was holding the same cup. He had dark hair and a red jacket. He was smiling at me. I blinked and the image disappeared. I dropped the cup. It landed in the leaves without making much sound. I walked back toward the campsite faster than before. When I reached Site 8, the light was already fading. I had brought a small tent because the owner had warned me that the road could become difficult after dark. I decided to stay anyway. It was supposed to rain again in the morning, and I wanted to finish the inspection early. I set up the tent, ate a cold dinner, and sat beside the fire with my notes. For the first hour, nothing happened. I heard the creek. I heard the wind. Once I heard something move through the brush, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I told myself I was letting childhood memories affect my judgment. I told myself that was all it was. Around 10:30, I turned off the fire. The campground became almost completely dark. I crawled into the tent and zipped it closed. I lay there listening to the rain begin again. Then I heard a branch snap outside. I held my breath. Another branch snapped. Closer this time. I reached for my flashlight. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. I was about to lie back down when I heard a voice from outside. Danny. My entire body went cold. I did not move. I stared at the darkness beyond the tent wall. The voice came again. Danny. Same voice. Same distance. Exactly the same as it had sounded when I was 9 years old. I wanted to believe it was a person. I wanted to believe someone had come into the campground. But there was no reason anyone should have been there. I slowly reached for the flashlight. My hand was shaking. I turned it on and pointed it toward the tent entrance. The beam stopped at the nylon wall. Then the voice spoke again. This time it was closer. Danny, come outside. I did not answer. I remembered my father's hand on my shoulder. I remembered his face. I remembered the warning. If you hear me calling you from the woods, make sure you can see me before you answer. I sat there for several minutes without moving. Then something touched the outside of the tent. Not a hand. Not an animal. It was a slow pressure against the fabric moving from the bottom of the wall toward the zipper. I watched the shape rise. It stopped at the height of my shoulder. Then it disappeared. I did not breathe. The voice came again. This time it sounded exactly like my father. Danny, I know you are in there. I closed my eyes. I did not answer. The voice became softer. Danny, it is me. I almost believed it. That was the worst part. For 1 second. I wanted to open the tent and see him standing there. I wanted my father to be alive again. I wanted that voice to be real. Then I remembered something else. Something I had forgotten for 27 years. My father had never called me Danny. Not once. He always called me by my full name. Always. Even when I was a child. I opened my eyes. The thing outside the tent went completely silent, and from somewhere deep in the woods, far beyond the campground, I heard my father's real voice for the first time in 11 years. It said my name once. Then it said something that made me understand why he had been so afraid that night. It said, "Do not let it see your face." I did not move for several seconds after hearing my father's voice from the woods. My entire body had gone rigid, and the only thing I could hear was the rain tapping against the tent and the slow sound of my own breathing. I kept staring at the tent wall where that pressure had appeared, expecting it to return, but nothing moved outside. The silence felt worse than the voice had, because now I knew there was something out there, and whatever it was had been close enough to touch the tent. I kept thinking about the last thing my father had said. Do not let it see your face. The words made no sense, but they had been spoken in his voice. his real voice. Not the imitation that had called me Danny. I wanted to believe that my mind was playing tricks on me, that grief and exhaustion, and the memories from childhood had combined into something that felt real. But there was one problem. I had never heard my father's voice say those words before, not in a dream, not in a memory, nowhere. And yet I knew the voice immediately, the same low, tired tone he had when he was trying not to frighten me. I reached slowly for my phone, even though I already knew there would be no signal. The screen lit up and showed the time, 11:47 p.m. I opened the emergency call screen and watched the signal indicator search for something that was not there. Nothing happened. I put the phone down. Then I heard the voice again, this time much farther away. Danny, do not look outside. I swallowed hard. I wanted to answer. I wanted to ask him what was happening. But the warning from 27 years ago kept repeating in my head. If you hear me calling you from the woods, make sure you can see me before you answer. I stayed inside the tent, sitting with my knees pulled toward my chest, listening. After several minutes, I heard footsteps moving through the leaves. They were slow, heavy footsteps, not the quick movement of an animal. Someone was walking around the campsite. I heard the steps pass behind the tent, then stop, then start again. They made a complete circle around me. Once, then twice, then a third time. Each time the footsteps came closer to the tent wall, and each time they stopped just outside. I kept my flashlight pointed at the ground, because I was afraid to let the beam pass through the fabric. I remembered the thing my father had said about seeing its face, and I suddenly wondered if he had been talking about something that could see me through the tent. The thought made my stomach tighten. I pulled the sleeping bag over my shoulders and tried to stay completely still. After a while, the footsteps stopped. Then I heard something scrape across the ground near the entrance. It sounded like a branch being dragged through wet leaves. Then the zipper on my tent moved slightly, not enough to open, just enough for the metal pull to make a tiny sound. I stared at it, my hand hovering over the flashlight. Then a voice whispered from the other side, "You remember me?" I did not answer. The voice waited. Then it said my full name, the name my father had always used, and that frightened me more than hearing Danny, because the thing outside had just learned something it should not have known. I moved backward until my shoulders touched the rear wall of the tent. The fabric was cold against my shirt. I could hear the rain falling harder now, and beneath it I could hear breathing, slow breathing, directly outside the entrance. Then the voice changed again. It became my father's voice, but this time it sounded younger, like the voice he had when I was a child. I heard him say that I needed to come outside because he had found something near the creek. That was exactly what he had said the night we camped here, or at least that was how I remembered it. But another memory surfaced, one I had not thought about since I was a child. I remembered my father standing beside the fire, looking toward the trees and telling me to stay where I was. I remembered him walking toward the creek, but I also remembered him stopping halfway down the trail and turning around, as if he had heard something. Then I remembered another boy, a small figure standing beside the fire, wearing a red jacket, holding a blue plastic cup. I had seen him earlier that afternoon near Site 7, but I had never told anyone about him. I had assumed he was another camper, yet the campground had been almost empty that night. I could not remember seeing a car, a tent, or another family, and now the name on the cup had come back to me. Even I whispered it without meaning to. The breathing outside stopped. The silence that followed was immediate. Then something scratched once against the tent wall. Even the voice whispered. I froze. It had heard me. The voice said the name again. Then it laughed softly, not like a human being laughing at a joke, but like someone trying to remember how laughter was supposed to sound. I covered my mouth with both hands, and for the first time that night I understood that whatever was outside was not simply repeating voices, it was listening. It was learning. It was waiting for me to give it something. I stayed awake until dawn. I did not sleep. Sometime around 3 in the morning the rain stopped, and with the rain gone the forest became almost completely silent. There were no birds, no insects, no creek, nothing. Then at around 4:30, I heard footsteps moving away from the campsite. They went toward Site 7, then continued down the road. I waited another hour before moving. When the sky began turning gray, I finally opened the tent. I did not look toward the trees at first. I kept my eyes on the ground. My hands were stiff from gripping the flashlight all night. There were footprints in the mud outside the tent. I expected them to look like boots, but they did not. They looked almost human, except the spacing was wrong. Each footprint was too far from the next one, as if whoever made them had been taking steps much longer than a normal person could. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared near Site 7. Then I noticed something else. There were no footprints leading toward my tent, only footprints leading away. That meant whatever had been outside had not walked to me from the road. It had already been there before I heard it. I packed my things quickly. I did not bother eating breakfast. I wanted to leave before the owner arrived, but when I reached my car, I found something sitting on the hood. It was the blue plastic cup, the same one I had dropped near the creek. It was clean now, completely clean, even though the ground had been wet and covered in mud. I stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. The name even was still written underneath. But there was something else now. Beneath the name was a second word, written in the same faded black marker, mine. I dropped the cup immediately. I looked around the campground. Every site was empty. Every picnic table was wet from the rain. There was nobody there. But I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was standing somewhere beyond the trees watching me. I got into the car and locked the doors. Then I started the engine. The road out of the campground looked different in the morning. Less threatening, more ordinary. And for a moment I felt embarrassed by how frightened I had been. I told myself that I had been exhausted, that the voice had been a dream, that the footprints were probably caused by an animal or some unusual pattern in the mud. I wanted those explanations. I needed them. I drove slowly toward the entrance, and when I reached the wooden sign, I stopped. Something had been carved into the back of it. I had not noticed it the day before. The letters were deep and fresh, as if someone had cut them into the wood recently. There were 3 names. The first was Even, the second was my father's full name, and the third was mine. I got out of the car and stared at them. My father's name was followed by a date. The date was 27 years earlier, the same day he had taken me camping. Beneath my name was another date, that day's date. I felt cold all over. I stepped backward and looked down the road. There was nobody there. But then I heard a sound from the trees behind me, a child laughing. I turned halfway before remembering the warning. Do not let it see your face. I stopped with my body facing the road and my head turned slightly toward the sound. I could not see anything, but I could hear a small voice whispering from somewhere behind the trees, "Danny." I did not answer. The voice whispered again, "Danny, your father told you the wrong rule." I stood completely still. The voice sounded like a child this time, and somehow that frightened me more than the adult voice had. Then the child said something else, something that made me realize my memory of that first camping trip was not incomplete by accident. It had been taken from me. "You were not 9 when you heard me," the child whispered. "You were 8. I felt my stomach drop, because I knew immediately that was true. I remembered my 9th birthday. I remembered the cake, the candles, the house, the school, and the summer after it. The camping trip had happened before my birthday, not after it, which meant I had spent 27 years remembering the wrong age. I looked at the trees without turning my face, and the child whispered again, "You were 8 years old when your father left you here." I almost turned around, but then I heard another voice behind me, my father's voice, very close, almost touching my ear. And this time he did not warn me. He said, "I did not leave you here. I came back for you." I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 27 years, another piece of that night returned. I remembered waking up alone beside the fire. I remembered the tent being gone. I remembered the campground looking exactly the way it looked now, empty and silent. And I remembered hearing my father calling my name from somewhere beyond the trees. But the worst part was what happened next. I remembered answering him. And the memory came back so suddenly that I almost fell to my knees beside the road. It was not like remembering a dream. There was no uncertainty around it, no blurred edges or missing pieces. It came back with the sharpness of something that had been waiting behind a locked door. I remembered the fire. I remembered the darkness beyond the campsite. And I remembered my father's voice calling my name from somewhere among the trees. I remembered being 8 years old, not 9, and I remembered standing up beside the fire because I believed he was waiting for me. I remembered taking 3 steps toward the trail, then stopping because another voice spoke from behind me. It was a boy's voice, quiet and frightened, and it said, "Don't go that way." I opened my eyes and realized I was still standing beside my car. The campground was empty around me. The old wooden sign was behind my shoulder, and the trees were completely still. I had been holding my breath without realizing it. I finally exhaled and looked at the ground. The blue cup was still there near my feet. I did not touch it. I got back into the car and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly that I had trouble getting the key into the ignition. When the engine finally started, I drove away without looking toward the campground again. I kept my eyes on the road, but the memory would not stop. It came in pieces as I drove, each piece fitting into the next one. And the more I remembered, the less sense my childhood made. I remembered my father taking me camping, but I no longer remembered him bringing a tent. I remembered sitting beside the fire, but I could not remember where I had slept. I remembered the creek, but I could not remember drinking the water, and most disturbing of all, I remembered another child being there, a boy named Ivan. I could see him clearly now. He had dark hair, a red jacket, and a small blue cup in his hands. He had been sitting across the fire from me, and I remembered asking him where his parents were. He had looked toward the trees before answering. He said they were looking for him. I remembered laughing because I thought he was joking. Then I remembered my father returning from the creek, and the moment he saw Ivan, everything changed. My father had dropped one of the water bottles. It hit a rock and rolled into the leaves. He had looked at the boy for several seconds without saying anything. Then he had walked over to me and grabbed my shoulder. I remembered his fingers pressing hard into my skin. I remembered him asking me one question. "Did he speak to you?" I had said yes, and my father had gone pale. I had forgotten that part until now. I had forgotten because something else had happened immediately afterward, something my mind had refused to keep. I remembered Ivan standing up. He had smiled at my father, and he had said, "You came back." My father had not answered. He had pulled me behind him. Then he told me to stay beside him. I remembered asking what was wrong, and he had looked down at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. He was afraid. Not of the boy exactly, but of something behind the boy, something deeper in the trees. I remembered my father whispering that we were leaving. I remembered him grabbing the tent and throwing it into the back of our vehicle. I remembered him throwing our food into a bag without packing it properly. And I remembered asking about Ivan. My father had told me not to look at him. I had asked why, and he said, because he was not alone. That sentence had stayed buried in my memory for 27 years. Now it came back with terrifying clarity. I drove until the campground disappeared behind me. But I did not feel safer. The road seemed longer than it had been when I arrived. The same trees repeated along the mountain. The same curves seemed to appear again and again. And after about 20 minutes, I realized I had not passed the old gas station that should have been near the main road. I checked the dashboard clock. It was 7:18 in the morning. I had left the campground shortly after sunrise, but the sky outside still looked almost black. I turned on the radio. There was nothing but static. I tried another station, static again. I tried to make a phone call, no signal. I kept driving, telling myself that mountain roads distorted distance, that the weather had changed, that I was tired. But then I saw something on the side of the road that made me slow down. It was an old blue road sign. The paint was peeling and the metal was rusted around the edges. I had passed that sign before. It had been beside the campground entrance, except now it was sitting several miles away. I looked at it as I drove past, and I saw the same 3 names carved into the back. Even my father's name. Mine. I slammed on the brakes. The car stopped on the wet pavement. I sat there staring through the windshield. my heart beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I put the car in reverse, but before I could move, someone knocked on the rear window. I froze. It was 3 slow knocks, then silence. I did not turn around. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. Another 3 knocks came from the back of the car. Then a child's voice said, "You forgot me." I closed my eyes. I wanted to drive away, but something inside me told me not to move. The voice came again, "You promised." I opened my eyes and looked into the rearview mirror. At first I saw only the empty back seat. Then the mirror shifted slightly as the car moved in the wind, and for a fraction of a second, I saw a small figure sitting behind me. A boy in a red jacket, holding a blue cup. I turned around without thinking. The back seat was empty. I looked back at the mirror. Nothing was there. I pushed the accelerator and drove. I did not stop until I reached the main road. When I finally saw other vehicles, I felt a relief so strong that I almost laughed. I pulled into the first gas station. I found and parked beside the building. There were 2 pickup trucks near the pumps and a woman inside buying coffee. I got out of the car and stood in the sunlight. It was the first time since leaving the campground that I felt like I was back in the real world. I walked inside and bought a bottle of water. The woman behind the counter looked at me, then looked at my clothes, then asked where I had been. I told her I had been camping. She asked where. I gave her the name of the campground. Her expression changed immediately. She looked toward the other employee standing near the coffee machine, then back at me. She asked if I had been there alone. I said yes. She did not say anything for several seconds. Then she asked me how long I had stayed. I told her 1 night. She looked confused. Then she asked me what day it was. I looked at the calendar behind her. The date was 2 days later than the one on my phone. I told her the date, and she stared at me. She said that was impossible. I had left the campground that morning, but according to her, the road had been closed for 2 days because of a landslide. She said nobody could have entered the campground since the previous afternoon. I told her that was not true. I had driven in myself. She shook her head and told me the entrance had been blocked by a fallen tree. I asked her if she knew the campground from years ago. She hesitated, then said her father used to take her there when she was a child. I asked her if she remembered a boy named Even. She stopped moving. The bottle in her hand slipped slightly, and she looked at me with an expression that made the air inside the store feel colder. She asked me why I knew that name. I told her about the blue cup, about the boy in the red jacket, and about the voice calling my name. She listened without interrupting. Then she told me that Even had disappeared from that campground when he was 8 years old. I asked when. She said 27 years ago. I felt the room tilt around me. She said his parents had been camping at Site 7. They had reported him missing after he vanished during the night. Search teams had spent 3 days looking through the woods and along the creek, but they never found him. I asked what happened to my father. She looked at me and said she remembered his name. She said my father had been one of the volunteers who helped search for the boy. I told her that was impossible. My father had taken me camping that same night. She stared at me for several seconds, then asked me if I was sure. I said yes. She asked me how old I was. I told her 36. She looked toward the door, then back at me, and quietly said, "Your father was never supposed to take you there." I felt a cold pressure move through my chest. I asked her what she meant. She said that after Even disappeared, my father had become obsessed with the campground. He believed the boy had not wandered away. He believed something in the woods had taken him. She said my father returned to the campground several times afterward, always alone, always after dark, until one night he disappeared too. I told her my father had not disappeared. He had died 11 years ago. She shook her head slowly, then asked me where he died. I told her he had died at home after a long illness. She looked confused again, and that was when I realized something was wrong with the story I had spent my entire life believing. She asked me if I had any photographs of him. I took out my phone and opened the first picture I found. It was an old family photograph from when I was in my 20s. My father was standing beside me, older, thinner, smiling at the camera. The woman looked at the photograph, then immediately stepped backward. She whispered that was not my father. I laughed because I thought she was joking, but she was not smiling. She said the man in the photograph was the same man who had been reported missing 27 years ago. I stared at the screen. I told her that was impossible. I had hundreds of memories of him after that night: birthdays, holidays, hospital visits, family dinners, conversations, everything. She shook her head, then asked me one question. When was the last time you saw your father before he died? I told her I had been with him in the hospital. She asked me what he said to me. I could not remember. I knew there had been a conversation. I remembered sitting beside his bed. I remembered holding his hand, but I could not remember a single word he had spoken. The woman looked at me and said that was because the man who came back from the campground was not your father. I felt something inside me collapse. I wanted to leave. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. But then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I looked at the screen. There was no incoming call, no message, no notification, just a voice recording that had appeared in my phone without me creating it. The file was named August 17, 1999. I stared at the date. That was the date of the camping trip. I pressed play. At first there was only static. Then I heard a campfire, then rain, then the sound of a little boy crying. I heard my own childhood voice asking where my father was. Then another voice answered. It was my father's voice, but he sounded terrified. He said, "Do not let it see your face." Then the recording became quiet, and a child whispered something directly into the microphone. "I know he is going to forget again." The woman beside me covered her mouth. I stopped the recording. Neither of us spoke. Then another sound came from the phone. The recording had not ended. Beneath the static, I heard a second voice, my own voice, but older, speaking as if I were standing somewhere far away. I heard myself say, "I am coming back for him." And then the child laughed, the same laugh I had heard beside the road. I looked at the woman, and she was staring at the entrance of the store. She whispered that someone was standing outside. I turned my eyes toward the glass without moving my head. At first I saw nothing. Then a small hand appeared against the window. A child's hand. Pale fingers pressed against the glass, and beneath the hand was the reflection of a boy in a red jacket holding a blue cup. I did not turn around. I did not look directly at him, because somewhere inside the oldest part of my memory, I finally remembered the last thing my father had told me before we left that campground 27 years ago. He had not told me to stay away from the woods. He had not told me never to answer the voice. He had looked directly into my eyes and said, "If you ever remember this place, it will know where you are." The hand stayed against the glass for several seconds. Small pale fingers pressed flat against the window, and I could not make myself look directly at the reflection. I kept staring at the counter instead, at the rows of candy bars and coffee cups, and the small metal rack filled with local maps. Anything that would keep my eyes away from the window. The woman behind the counter whispered that I needed to leave. I asked her why. She said, "Because it had followed me." I asked what it was, and she told me she did not know. Not exactly. She said people around there had different names for it. Some called it the caller, some called it the second voice, and some older people simply called it the thing in the woods. But nobody who had seen enough of it used a name for very long. She said names seemed to matter to it, especially names spoken aloud. I looked at her and asked why it had called me Danny. She said that was not my real name. I told her it was what my father had called me when I was a kid. She shook her head. She said, "Your father called you that because someone else called you that first." I felt a cold sensation move down my back. I asked her what she meant. She looked toward the window again. The hand was gone, but the reflection remained. The boy in the red jacket was still standing outside. His face was turned toward the glass. I could not see his eyes clearly, but I knew he was looking at me. The woman told me not to stare at him, so I looked down. She told me to walk to my car without turning around. She said I should drive to the county hospital and stay somewhere with other people until daylight. I asked her what would happen if I went home. She said if it had followed me that far, home would not make any difference. I asked her why, and she said because it did not follow people the way animals followed a scent. It followed memories. I did not understand what that meant. She told me that was why my father had tried to make me forget the campground. She said forgetting was not enough, though, because the thing could wait. She said sometimes it waited for decades. I looked at the phone again. The recording was still open. The file remained on the screen. August 17, 1999. I asked her if she knew what happened that night. She nodded. But she said she only knew what people in town had been told. She said there had been a search for a missing boy named Ivan, and during the search my father had become convinced that something was using the boy's voice to lure people into the woods. He had told the search team that he had heard Ivan calling for help from places where no one could possibly have been standing. He said the voice always sounded close, even when it came from far away, and he said the worst part was that it sometimes sounded like someone the listener loved. I asked her how she knew all this. She said her father had been part of the search team, and he had kept notes because he believed the police were ignoring important details. She went into a storage room behind the counter and returned with a small cardboard box. She put it on the counter between us. The box was old and stained along the edges. She said her father had died years ago, but she had kept his papers. She opened the box and took out several folded pages. Most of them were handwritten. The ink had faded, but I could still read parts of it. There were dates, times, names, and descriptions of places around the campground. One page had a rough map of the property. Another showed the creek and the trail leading toward Site 7. I looked at the map and immediately noticed something wrong. There was another trail marked behind the campground, a trail that did not appear on the modern map I had used for the inspection. I asked her where it went. She said her father called it the Old Trail. She said it had been closed before she was born because the ground near it had become unstable. I asked if it led toward the place where Ivan disappeared. She said no, it led away from it, toward an abandoned maintenance road that had been removed from official maps decades ago. I looked at the handwritten notes again. One sentence had been underlined several times. Do not search for the missing after sunset. I asked why, and she said because that was when the voices started. I asked if anyone had ever found Ivan. She shook her head, but then she corrected herself. She said they found his jacket, they found one shoe, and they found the blue cup. I looked at the woman. The cup was the same one I had seen at the campsite. She said the police cataloged it as evidence, but it disappeared before the case was closed. She said nobody knew where it went. I asked her if my father had taken it. She said she did not know, but her father had written that my father had been holding something when he came out of the woods the morning after Ivan disappeared. I asked what it was. She looked down at the paper, then said he was carrying a blue plastic cup. My stomach tightened. I asked her why my father would have had it. She said that was the question nobody could answer. I looked at the recording on my phone again. The sound of the child crying played faintly from the speaker, because the file had not stopped completely. I turned the volume down. Then the woman asked me something I had not expected. She asked if I remembered what Ivan looked like. I told her yes. She asked if I remembered his face. I said I did. She asked me to describe it. I hesitated, because the more I tried to picture him, the harder it became. I remembered his hair, his red jacket, the cup in his hands, but his face was strangely difficult to hold in my mind. Every time I tried to focus on his eyes, the image seemed to move away from me. I told her that, and she closed the box immediately. She said that was how it started. I asked what she meant. She said her father had written that people who saw the boy often remembered everything except his face. She said the mind protected itself by removing the detail that caused the most fear. I asked her what was frightening about his face. She did not answer. Instead, she told me that her father had once interviewed a man who claimed he saw Ivan standing beside the creek 3 days after the boy disappeared. The man said Ivan looked exactly the same as he had on the night he vanished. Same clothes, same age, same cup. And when the man approached him, the boy asked one question. He asked if the man knew where his father was. The man said he did, and then he heard his own name spoken from behind him. He turned around, and when he looked back, the boy was gone. The man later became convinced that something had copied his voice, because for weeks afterward he heard himself calling from empty rooms. I asked what happened to him. She said he moved away. Then she paused. She said he killed himself 8 months later. I did not know what to say. She closed the box and told me I needed to leave. I thanked her and walked outside. The parking lot was empty except for my car. The sky had cleared, and the morning light had become brighter. Everything looked normal, almost painfully normal. I walked toward the car without looking at the trees. Just as she had instructed, I unlocked the door, got inside and started the engine. Then I saw something on the passenger seat. It was the blue cup. I had not put it there. I had not touched it since leaving the campground, yet it was sitting upright on the seat as if someone had placed it there carefully. The name Even was visible on the bottom. I reached for it, then stopped. Beneath Even was another word. The same word I had seen earlier, mine. I left the cup on the seat and drove. I did not know where I was going at first. I simply wanted to put distance between myself and the mountains. But after several miles, I realized I was heading toward the county hospital. The woman had told me to go there, and part of me still believed that being around other people would make me feel safer. When I arrived, I went inside and sat in the emergency department waiting room. There were nurses moving through the halls, patients sitting in chairs, televisions playing quietly from the walls. And for the first time since the campground, I felt surrounded by ordinary human life. I sat there for almost an hour. Nobody bothered me. Nobody called my name. Nobody stood outside the windows. Eventually, a nurse came over and asked if I was all right. I told her I had been camping and had gotten confused on the road. She asked if I had injured myself. I said no. She asked if I needed medical attention. I said no. She told me I could stay in the waiting room as long as I needed. I thanked her. Then I leaned back and closed my eyes. I must have fallen asleep, because when I opened them it was nearly noon. The waiting room had changed. Some people were gone. New people had arrived, and sunlight was coming through the windows. I felt embarrassed by everything that had happened. Sitting in a hospital because of a voice in the woods suddenly seemed ridiculous. I took out my phone and played the recording again. This time with headphones, I listened carefully. There were long sections of static. The sound of rain, my childhood voice, my father's voice, and the child whispering. Then I heard something underneath the recording that I had not noticed before. A second conversation, very quiet, almost hidden beneath the sound of the fire. I turned the volume up, and I heard my father speaking to someone. He sounded angry, then frightened. He said, "You cannot have him." Another voice answered. It was a child's voice, but it did not sound like Even, it sounded like me. I heard the voice say, "He already belongs to us." My father said no. Then there was a loud sound, like something striking the microphone. After that came several seconds of silence. Then my father whispered something that made me pause the recording. He said, "If he forgets me, let him live." I stared at the screen. My hands were cold. I replayed that part 3 times. The words did not change. "If he forgets me, let him live." I suddenly understood why my memories of my father had always felt strange. There had been gaps, not just from childhood, but from my entire life, small moments I had never questioned, birthdays where I could remember the room, but not who had been there, vacations where I remembered arriving but not leaving, conversations where I knew what had been discussed, but could not remember the words. I had always assumed that was normal, but now I wondered how much of my life had been removed. I thought about the woman saying the thing followed memories, and I realized something worse. Perhaps it did not need to follow me physically. Perhaps it only needed me to remember enough. I looked through my old photographs on the phone. Hundreds of them. Family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, work events, pictures with friends, pictures of my father. I started scrolling backward through the years, and at first everything looked normal. Then I noticed something strange. In several photographs taken during the same period, my father was standing farther away from me than I remembered. Sometimes he was in the background, sometimes behind a doorway, sometimes partially hidden by another person, and in one photograph he was standing outside a window, watching me from the yard. I had no memory of that moment. I zoomed in on the image. The window reflected the room behind me, and in the reflection I could see myself sitting at a table. But there was another small figure standing beside me, a boy in a red jacket. I dropped the phone onto my lap. I stared at the picture until my vision blurred. Then the nurse came back and asked if I needed anything. I closed the photograph and said no. She walked away, and I tried to breathe normally. But something had changed. I no longer wanted to know what happened to my father. I no longer wanted to know what happened to Ivan. I wanted to know what happened to me. Because if the thing had been calling my name since I was 8 years old, then maybe the campground was not where this started. Maybe it was where something had happened to me. And maybe my father had spent the rest of his life trying to keep me from remembering it. I looked at the blue cup sitting inside my car through the hospital window. I could see it from where I was sitting, even from that distance. And for one impossible moment, I saw a small hand wrapped around it. I blinked. The hand was gone. But the cup had moved. It was no longer on the passenger seat. It was sitting on the dashboard, facing the windshield, and written across the inside of the cup in faded black marker were 3 words, "I remember you." I stared at the words on the inside of the cup until they stopped looking like letters and started looking like scratches. "I remember you," 3 words written in faded black marker, the same handwriting as the name on the bottom. I did not touch the cup. I did not even want to get closer to the window. I sat there watching my car from the hospital waiting room, while people moved around me as if nothing unusual had happened. A nurse pushed a cart past the glass doors. 2 paramedics walked through the lobby. An older man argued quietly with someone on the phone. A child sat beside his mother eating crackers from a plastic package. All of those ordinary things should have made me feel safe. Instead, they made me feel strangely exposed, because I had begun to understand that whatever had been following me did not care whether I was alone in the woods. It could reach me anywhere. I looked down at my phone again. The photograph of me sitting at the table was still open. I zoomed in on the boy standing beside me, and this time I could see his face more clearly, or at least I thought I could. His skin looked pale, his eyes were dark, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he were about to say something. I stared at the photograph until my eyes began to hurt. Then I noticed something behind him. There was a second figure standing near the doorway, taller than the boy, wearing a dark jacket. The face was turned away from the camera, but the shape of the shoulders looked familiar. I zoomed in again. The image became blurry, and then I realized who it resembled: my father. I closed the photograph, put the phone in my pocket, and stood up. I needed to get out of the hospital, not because I thought it was dangerous, but because I had the feeling that every minute I spent looking at old photographs was giving something more information about me. I walked outside, crossed the parking lot, and stopped beside my car. The blue cup was still on the dashboard. I opened the driver's door, got inside, and immediately noticed that the passenger seat was wet. There was a dark patch across the fabric, as if someone had been sitting there with soaked clothes. I touched it with 2 fingers. The water was cold, almost freezing, and it smelled like wet leaves. I pulled my hand away. The smell was the same smell I remembered from that first camping trip: wet earth, pine needles, smoke. And something else that I could never identify. I started the engine, then looked at the cup. I wanted to throw it away, but something stopped me. I could not explain why, but I knew that if I left it behind, I would eventually have to go back for it. So I picked it up and placed it inside the glove compartment. I shut the compartment and locked it. Even though there was no lock, then I drove away. I did not return to the campground that day. I drove to a motel near the highway and rented a room under my own name. The woman at the desk barely looked at me. She handed me a key and pointed toward the stairs. I carried my bag upstairs, entered the room, locked the door, checked the bathroom, checked the closet, checked beneath the bed, and then laughed quietly at myself. I had never behaved like that before. I had stayed in remote cabins alone. I had slept in my truck beside logging roads. I had worked inside abandoned buildings. But that night at the campground had changed something in me. I no longer trusted empty spaces. I no longer trusted familiar voices. And most of all, I no longer trusted my own memories. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my phone. I searched for the campground again, this time using the old name printed on the inspection paperwork. Several local news articles appeared. Most of them were old. One article was dated August 18th, 1999. The headline mentioned the disappearance of an 8-year-old boy named Ivan. I opened it. The article said the boy had vanished from a family campsite during the night. His parents had reported hearing him outside the tent shortly before he disappeared. They assumed he had gone toward the creek. Search teams found his jacket near Site 7. But there was no sign of the boy. Another article said my father had been one of the volunteers who joined the search. That did not surprise me anymore. What surprised me was the date of my father's involvement. He had supposedly arrived at the campground the morning after Ivan disappeared, not the night before, according to the article. He had told police that he had heard a child calling for help from the woods. But when he followed the voice, he found nothing. I read the article 3 times. Then I searched for my father's name. More results appeared, and an old newspaper article from 2 years later mentioned that my father had been questioned after returning to the campground without permission. He had claimed he was looking for evidence that had been overlooked during the original search. The police had warned him to stay away. Another article mentioned that my father had become convinced the boy was still alive. Then the records stopped. There was nothing about my father after that. No report about him taking me camping. No mention of me being there. No explanation for the memories I had carried for 27 years. I called my mother's sister, the only person still alive who had known my father well. She answered after several rings. I almost hung up. But then I asked her if she remembered the campground in West Virginia. There was a long silence. Then she asked why I was asking. I told her I had been there. She said that was impossible. I asked why. She said my father had taken me there when I was 8, but he had not brought me home. I felt my throat tighten. I asked what she meant. She told me my father had disappeared for 3 days, and when he returned, he was alone. She said I was found with him at a motel in another county, not at home. I asked why nobody had ever told me. She said my mother had tried to protect me. She said doctors believed I had experienced a traumatic event and that my memories were confused. I asked what happened to my father during those 3 days. She said nobody knew. I asked why she had never told me about Ivan. She said she thought I knew. I told her I did not. Then she said something that made me sit completely still. She said your father told your mother that Ivan had been calling your name. I asked what she meant. She said the boy had called me Danny. Even though he had never met me before, I asked her how she knew that. She said my father had written it down. He had left a notebook in his truck. My mother found it after he died. I asked if she still had the notebook. She said yes. I asked her to read me the last page. She refused. I asked why. She said because the last page was written in my father's handwriting. But the words were not written from his point of view. She said they were written as if someone else had been speaking through him. I asked her what the last sentence said. She was quiet for so long that I thought the call had disconnected. Then she said it said, "He is beginning to remember." I asked where the notebook was. She said she could bring it to me, but she did not want to come to the motel. She said we should meet somewhere public the next morning. I agreed. Then she asked me one final question. She asked if I had brought anything home from the campground. I did not answer. I looked toward the glove compartment. Then I said no. She told me that was good, because my father had written that the object connected to the missing boy should never be brought into a house. I asked what object she meant, but the line went silent. I checked the phone. The call had ended. I tried calling her back. She did not answer. I sat on the bed for several minutes. Then I heard a sound from inside the room, a small plastic click. I looked toward the nightstand. Nothing was there. Then I heard another click, this time from the glove compartment of my car parked outside. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked down into the parking lot. My car was still there. The doors were locked. No one was near it. But the passenger window was slowly moving down. I stared at it, unable to understand what I was seeing. The window stopped halfway. Anne and a small pale hand appeared inside the car, fingers curled over the edge of the glass. I backed away from the window. My heart was pounding. Then my phone vibrated. It was a message from my aunt. There was no text, only a photograph. I opened it. The picture showed my father standing beside a car at the campground 27 years earlier. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It was the same car my father owned when I was a child. I zoomed in. He was holding something in his right hand, the blue cup. Beside him stood a little boy in a red jacket, and behind them was a second figure standing among the trees. I could not see the face, but I recognized the posture. I recognized the way the figure held its shoulders. I recognized the jacket, and I knew exactly what I was looking at. It was me, not the adult me, but the 8-year-old version of me, standing several yards behind my father, looking directly toward the camera. I stared at the photograph until my hands began to shake. Then another message arrived from my aunt. This time there were only 4 words. "That is not you." I called her immediately. She answered on the first ring. And before I could speak, she said, "I need you to listen carefully." I asked her what she meant. She said the boy in that photograph was not me. She said my father had taken the photograph after he returned from the woods. She said I was not standing behind him. I had been inside the motel room at the time. I asked her how she knew. She said because she had seen the original photograph, and in the original there was nobody standing behind my father. I asked her what happened to the image. She said someone had altered it. I asked who. She said she did not know, but she had found the same figure in several other photographs over the years, always standing somewhere near my family, sometimes behind my father, sometimes outside the house, sometimes reflected in windows, always farther away, always watching. I asked her why she had never told me. She said because my mother made her promise. I asked what my mother had been afraid of. She said my mother believed the thing had attached itself to me when I was 8, and that every time I remembered the campground, it came closer. I asked her what happened if it got close enough. She did not answer immediately. Then she said my father believed it could not take someone who remembered the truth. But he was wrong. I asked how she knew. She said because the last time my father went back to the campground, he remembered everything, and he still disappeared. I looked through the motel window again. The passenger window of my car was now completely open. The blue cup was sitting on the roof, and the rain had started falling again. I asked my aunt where the notebook was. She said she would bring it to me in the morning. I asked her to come now. She said she could not. I asked why, and she whispered that someone had been standing outside her house for the last 20 minutes. I heard a noise in the background. Then her voice became quieter. She said it was calling her by my mother's name. I told her to lock the doors. She said she already had. Then she asked me if I could hear anything in my room. I listened. At first there was nothing. Then I heard a faint sound from the bathroom, 3 slow knocks against the door. My aunt heard them too through the phone. She whispered that I needed to leave the motel immediately. I asked where I should go. She said somewhere with other people. Somewhere bright, somewhere without trees. I stood there listening to her breathing. Then the bathroom door moved slightly. I watched the handle turn downward. My aunt whispered my name, not Danny, my full name. And then another voice came through the phone, the same voice that had called me from the woods. It said, "You should not have remembered him." I dropped the phone. The bathroom door opened slowly. There was nobody behind it, only darkness, and on the bathroom mirror, written in water across the glass, were 4 words, "Your father is still here." I stared at the words on the bathroom mirror until the water began to run downward, breaking the letters apart. "Your father is still here." I could not move. The phone was lying on the carpet near my feet, and my aunt's breathing was still coming through the speaker. I could hear her asking if I was there. I picked up the phone and whispered that I was still in the room. She told me to get outside immediately. I asked her what was happening, but before she could answer, I heard something behind me, a soft scrape against the bathroom tile. I turned my head just enough to see the edge of the mirror. There was a reflection in it, a man standing behind me. I knew the shape of his shoulders before I saw his face. It was my father. He looked exactly the way I remembered him from the last year of his life. Thin, pale, exhausted, wearing the dark jacket he had worn almost every winter. I did not turn around. I kept looking at him through the mirror. His eyes were fixed on me, but there was something wrong with his face. It looked slightly out of focus, as if the reflection belonged to a photograph that had been damaged by water. My aunt was still talking through the phone, asking me what I could see. I whispered that my father was standing behind me. She went completely silent. Then she said something I will never forget. She said, "If he looks like your father, do not trust him." I looked at the reflection again. My father's mouth slowly opened, but he did not speak. Instead, the voice came through my phone. It was his voice, the same voice that had spoken to me from the woods. He said, "You should have stayed, forgotten." I stepped backward. My shoulder hit the bathroom door, and the reflection moved closer even though I had not moved. I saw his hand rise in the mirror, and he placed one finger against his lips, telling me to be quiet. Then the bathroom light went out. I screamed and ran toward the motel room door. I did not look back. I grabbed my bag, opened the door, and ran down the stairs. The hallway was empty. The motel television in the lobby was playing quietly. The desk clerk was gone, and outside the rain had become heavy enough to blur the parking lot lights. I ran toward my car, but stopped when I saw the blue cup sitting on the roof. The passenger door was open. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it, but now the door was open, and there were wet footprints on the seat, small footprints, like those of a child. I backed away from the car. My aunt was still on the phone. She told me not to get inside. I asked her where I should go. She said there was an old church 3 miles south of the motel. She said it was one of the few places my father believed the voices could not enter. I asked why. She said because the church had no trees around it, and because people had been gathering there every night during the original search. I asked if she was coming. She said she was already on the road. Then the call cut out. I stood in the rain with the phone in my hand, watching the open car door, and then I heard my father's voice from inside the vehicle. It said, "Come on, we need to go." I almost answered, but I remembered the rule: make sure you can see me before you answer. I looked into the car. The seats were empty. I said nothing. The voice came again, this time softer. "I can explain everything." I stepped backward, and the car door slammed shut by itself. I ran toward the road. I did not care where I was going. I just needed to get away from the motel. I found a taxi waiting near the entrance and climbed into the back seat. The driver looked at me through the mirror and asked if I needed a hospital. I said I needed the old church south of here. He stared at me for a second, then asked which church. I gave him the name my aunt had mentioned. His face changed. He said nobody went there anymore. I asked why. He said the church had burned down years ago. I told him I did not care. I asked him to take me there anyway. He hesitated, then started driving. The rain beat against the windows. The road lights stretched into long blurred lines, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. Then the driver asked me if I had been camping. I said yes. He asked where. I gave him the campground name. He looked at me through the mirror again, then asked if I had found anything. I asked what he meant. He said people who go there sometimes come back with things they did not have when they left. I asked him how he knew. He said his brother disappeared there when he was a teenager. I asked if his brother was named Ivan. He nearly hit the brakes. The taxi swerved slightly before he corrected it. He asked me why I knew that name. I told him about the cup, about the boy, about my father, and about the voice. He listened without interrupting. Then he told me his brother had not been named Ivan. His brother had been 16 years old, but he had disappeared after hearing the voice of their mother calling him from the woods. He said his brother answered once, then disappeared. The police searched for him for 5 days, and on the 6th day they found his shoes beside a creek. I asked if anyone ever found his body. He said no. I asked what happened afterward. He said his mother spent the rest of her life hearing her son's voice outside the house, calling her by her name, asking her to come outside. I looked out the window. The rain had started to weaken, and through the glass I saw the trees along the road, one by one. They seemed to lean toward the car as we passed. The driver noticed me staring and told me not to look too long. I asked why. He said, because sometimes the road does not lead where you think it does. I did not understand. Then I realized we had been driving for almost 30 minutes. Even though the church was supposed to be 3 miles away, I asked him how far we were. He looked at the dashboard, then at me, and said we had already passed it. I asked him to turn around, he said. He could not. I asked why, and he pointed toward the road ahead. There was a wooden sign standing beside the pavement. The same sign from the campground. 3 names were carved into it, even my father's name, mine. The driver slammed on the brakes, the taxi stopped, and for several seconds neither of us moved. Then the driver whispered that we had to get out. I asked why. He said because the road had changed. I looked ahead. The pavement disappeared into fog. There were no houses, no streetlights, no other vehicles, only trees. The driver opened his door and told me to run toward the field on the left. I asked where the church was. He said it was not there anymore. I asked what he meant. He said the church had been gone for 20 years, and we were no longer on the road. I stepped out of the taxi. My shoes sank into wet grass, and when I turned around, the taxi was gone. There was no sound of an engine, no tire marks, nothing. I was standing alone in a field surrounded by trees. The fog was moving slowly across the ground, and somewhere in the distance I could hear a church bell, one single strike, then another. I followed the sound because I had nowhere else to go. After several minutes, I saw the church through the fog. It was not burned down. It was old but intact. The windows were dark, the doors were open, and there was a small wooden cross above the entrance. I walked inside. The air smelled like dust and old wood. There were rows of empty benches, and at the front of the church stood a table covered with photographs. I walked toward it. Every photograph showed people who had disappeared in the mountains: children, teenagers, adults, entire families. Some photographs were decades old, some were recent, and several of them showed the same campground. I saw Site 7. I saw the creek. I saw the old maintenance road. And then I saw a photograph of my father. He was standing beside the campfire, holding the blue cup. But this photograph showed something I had never seen before. I was standing beside him, but I was not 8 years old. I was an adult. The photograph appeared to have been taken only a few years ago. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and on the back was a handwritten note. "You came back once before." I turned the photograph over again, and this time I noticed another figure standing behind me, the boy in the red jacket. I whispered Ivan's name, and the church doors slammed shut behind me. I ran toward them, but they would not open. Then the bell above the church rang again, this time 3 times, and a voice spoke from the front of the room. My father's voice. It said, "You finally remembered." I turned slowly. The photographs on the table were no longer still. Several of them had changed. The people inside them were looking toward me, and in every photograph the same boy was standing somewhere in the background, holding the blue cup. I stepped backward. Then I heard my own childhood voice from behind the altar, asking where my father was. I looked toward the dark space beneath the altar, and something moved there. A small figure crawled slowly into the light, wearing a red jacket, holding the blue cup. I could not see his face, but I knew it was Ivan. He stopped several feet away from me, lifted the cup, and whispered that he had been waiting for me to remember the promise. I asked what promise. He said the promise my father made before he left me. I asked what my father had promised him. The boy looked toward the altar, then back at me, and said, "Your father promised to bring you back." I felt the room become colder. I asked why. The boy said, "Because you were the only one who could take his place." I backed away. The church bell began ringing again, faster now, and from outside the walls came dozens of voices, men, women, children, all calling different names, all asking someone to come outside. Then I heard my father's voice above all of them. He called me by my real name, not Danny, not the name the boy had used. And he said the one thing that made me understand why my father had spent 27 years trying to keep me from remembering. He said, "I was never trying to protect you from the thing. I was trying to protect the thing from you. I was never trying to protect you from the thing. I was trying to protect the thing from you." I stood there unable to understand what my father meant. The church bell continued ringing above me, each strike shaking something loose inside my head. Memories that had been buried for so long were beginning to rise all at once. I saw myself at 8 years old standing beside the fire. I saw my father holding the blue cup. I saw Ivan sitting across from me, and behind him I saw something tall standing between the trees, something that did not belong to the shape of the forest. I could not see its face, but I remembered being afraid of it before I even knew what fear was. The boy in the red jacket was still standing in front of me, his head tilted slightly to one side, the blue cup hanging from his hand. I asked him what my father meant. Ivan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the altar, then toward the photographs covering the table. He said, "Your father thought you were different." I asked, "Different how?" He said, "You could hear it without losing yourself." I told him I did not understand. He said that was why your father kept making you forget. Because every time you remembered the woods, it remembered you too. I looked at the church doors. They were still closed, but the voices outside had stopped. The silence was so complete that I could hear the faint movement of dust across the wooden floor. I asked even where my father was. He pointed toward the photographs. I looked at the table again, and one of the pictures had changed. It showed my father standing beside the creek. But this time he was not alone. There was another man standing beside him, someone I did not recognize. The man was holding a lantern and looking directly toward the camera. I stepped closer, and the photograph changed again. The man was gone. My father was kneeling beside the creek, and a small child was standing behind him. I recognized the child immediately. It was me, but I was wearing the red jacket, not the clothes I remembered wearing that night. I picked up the photograph. My fingers were trembling, and on the back were words written in my father's handwriting. He heard it before I did. I turned the photograph over again, and another picture beneath it caught my attention. It showed the campground from above. 12 numbered sites arranged around the loop road. Site 7 was marked with a black circle, and beside the creek was a small structure that did not appear on any modern map. I asked Ivan what it was. He said that was where the voices came from. I asked what was inside. He said nothing. I asked why he was afraid of it. He looked at me and said because there was never anything inside. I did not understand. He said people thought the voices came from a place, but they did not. They came from people who had already disappeared. I asked him how he knew. He said because he had heard all of them. I looked at the photographs again. There were dozens of faces, some young, some old, some barely visible beneath scratches and stains. And then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Every photograph had one person who looked directly toward the camera, and every one of those people was standing somewhere near the woods. I asked Ivan if they were the missing people. He nodded. I asked if they were dead. He said some were not. I asked what that meant. He said the ones who were dead could not come back, but the ones who were still there could. I asked where there was. He pointed toward the church floor, directly beneath my feet. I stepped backward. The wooden boards creaked, and then I heard something underneath them. 3 slow knocks. I froze. The sound came again. 3 knocks. Then a child's voice whispered my name. I did not answer. Ivan watched me carefully. Then he said, "It knows you are awake now." I asked what it wanted. He said it wanted what my father had taken from it. I asked what my father had taken, and Ivan lifted the blue cup. He said this. I stared at the cup, suddenly understanding why my father had always avoided talking about that night. I asked what was special about it. Ivan said it was not the cup that mattered. It was what had been inside it. I asked what had been inside. He said a piece of you. I told him that made no sense. He said your father put something inside the cup, so it could not find you. I asked what something. He said your name. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like the air inside the church had suddenly become too thin. I asked him how a name could be put inside a cup. He said not the name you use now. The first name, the one your father gave you before anyone else knew it. I shook my head. I told him my name had never been a secret. He said that was not what he meant. He said the thing in the woods did not hunt people by their names. It hunted them by the memory attached to the name. And my father had taken that memory away from me. I looked at the cup again. The word even was still written underneath, but now I could see another line beneath it, a line I had not noticed before. It was almost completely faded, but I could make out the first few letters of my own name. I asked Ivan if my father had put my name inside the cup. He said yes. Then I asked why the cup had my name and his name. He said because your father needed it to remember both of you. I felt a sudden wave of dizziness. I grabbed the edge of the table, and another memory came back. I remembered being 8 years old inside this same church. I remembered sitting on one of the wooden benches, crying because I could not find my father. I remembered a man kneeling in front of me, telling me everything would be fine. I remembered looking at his face and knowing it was not my father. I remembered the man smiling, and I remembered my father running into the church from the rain, shouting at him to stay away from me. The memory ended with a loud sound, something breaking. Then darkness. I opened my eyes. Ivan was still standing there, but he looked different now, older somehow, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. I asked him how long he had been here. He said since the night he disappeared. I asked how he had survived. He said he had not. I asked what he meant. He said the boy I remembered was gone a long time ago. What remained was the part that remembered the way out. I asked him if he was a ghost. He said no. He said ghosts belong to the dead, and he was not allowed to die. I felt a chill move through me. I asked who would not let him die. He pointed toward the church doors. The voices outside started again, hundreds of them this time, whispering names, calling for people who were not there. Then one voice rose above the others. It was my mother's voice. I had not heard it in years. She called me by the childhood name I had forgotten. I almost turned toward the door, but Ivan grabbed my wrist. His hand was ice cold. He told me not to listen. I asked why she was calling me. He said because she was not your mother. I knew that, but hearing her voice still made something inside me. The voice outside became louder. It said that she missed me, that she had been waiting for me, that my father had lied to me. I asked Ivan if my mother knew about the campground. He said she knew enough to be afraid. I asked why she never told me. He said because your father made her promise. I asked what promise. He said she promised never to say your first name after dark. I felt my mouth go dry. I asked what my first name was. Ivan looked at me, and for the first time since I had seen him, he looked frightened. He said, "You do not want to know." I told him I needed to know. He shook his head. Then the church bell stopped. Every voice outside stopped with it. The silence that followed was absolute. Ivan dropped the cup. It struck the floor and rolled toward me. I watched it spin until it stopped against my shoe. Then someone knocked on the church doors. Once, twice, 3 times. Ivan whispered that my father was outside. I asked how he could know. He said, because your father always knocks 3 times. I stood there staring at the doors, my heart beating hard enough to hurt. Then my father's voice came through the wood. He said my name, not Danny, not the name Ivan had used, my real name, the name I had not heard since I was 8 years old. I felt something inside me break open. And suddenly I remembered everything. I remembered the first night at the campground. I remembered my father taking me into the woods. I remembered the old maintenance road. I remembered the abandoned structure beside the creek. And I remembered what happened when we reached it. My father had not taken me there to search for Ivan. He had taken me there because he knew something was waiting for me. He had told me to stand behind him. Then he had opened the blue cup and poured a small amount of black water onto the ground. The forest had gone silent, and something had spoken from the darkness. It had used my father's voice, then my mother's voice, then my own voice. My father had told it that I was not ready, and the thing had answered that I would be. I remembered my father placing his hand on my head and telling me to forget. He said, forget this place, forget Ivan, forget me if you have to, but never remember the sound of my voice here. Then I remembered something else, something that made me understand why my father had been afraid of me. I had looked into the darkness and heard the thing calling my name, but instead of being afraid, I had answered it, and when I did, Every tree around us had begun to move, not from the wind, but toward me. My father had grabbed me and pulled me away. The thing had screamed, and for the first time it had sounded afraid. I opened my eyes inside the church. Ivan was staring at me. He whispered that I remembered now. I nodded. He asked if I remembered what happened next. I told him no. He said my father took me away, but he could not take everything. A piece of the thing had followed me. I asked where it was. Ivan pointed toward the floor, directly beneath the church. I heard something moving below us. Then the wooden boards began to bend upward, one by one, as if something underneath was pressing against them. Ivan stepped backward. He told me we had to leave. I asked how. He said through the old trail behind the altar. I looked toward the back of the church. There was a narrow wooden door I had not noticed before. I ran toward it, but before I could reach it, the front doors opened, slowly, without a sound. Cold air poured into the church, and my father walked inside. He looked exactly as I remembered him, older, pale, exhausted, wearing the same dark jacket. He stopped several feet away, looked at me, and said, "I am sorry." I asked him why. He said, "Because I was the only person who could stop it." I asked him what he meant. He looked toward Ivan, then back at me, and said, "You were never the thing it wanted. You were the thing it was afraid of." I asked why it had followed me for 27 years. My father said, "Because it knew that one day you would remember what you did to it." I stared at him, unable to breathe. I asked what I had done. My father looked at the blue cup on the floor, then said, "You were the one who called Ivan into the woods." I stood there staring at my father, unable to make sense of what he had just said. "You were the one who called Ivan into the woods." The words kept repeating inside my head, and for several seconds, I could not even remember how to breathe. Ivan was standing behind me, the blue cup still lying on the floor between us, and my father looked older than he had in any of the memories I had recovered. His face seemed exhausted, almost hollow, as if he had spent 27 years carrying something that had become too heavy to hold. I asked him what he meant. He did not answer. I asked him again, and this time my voice came out louder. "What did I do to Ivan?" My father looked at the boy in the red jacket, then back at me, and said, "You did not know what you were doing." I told him that was not an answer. He said it was the only answer that mattered. I stepped closer, and he immediately raised one hand, telling me to stop. He said there were things in this place that reacted to fear, things that reacted to anger, and things that reacted to memory. But the thing beneath the woods reacted to recognition. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant that the moment I remembered what I had done, it would know I was ready. I asked, "Ready for what?" He looked toward the floor, and the boards beneath us gave another slow creak. Something underneath the church moved again. I could hear a faint scraping sound beneath the wood. My father told me we did not have much time. I asked him why he had brought me here as a child. He said because Ivan had already been taken, and he thought I was the only person who could bring him back. I told him that made no sense. He said he believed the voices were connected to certain people, and that I had heard them before anyone else. He said, when I was 8 years old, I could hear voices from places where nobody was standing. I asked him if that was why he took me camping. He said yes, but he had not known what the campground really was. He had believed it was simply a place where people disappeared. He did not understand that the disappearances were connected to something much older, something that had been there before the campground existed. I asked him what was beneath the church. He said nothing that could be explained in words. I told him I wanted the truth. He looked at me and said the truth would not help me. It would only make me remember more. I told him I already remembered enough. Then Ivan spoke from behind me. He said he was still lying. My father looked at him, and something changed in his expression. He looked angry for the first time. He told Ivan to stay away from me. Ivan laughed softly, and the sound made my skin crawl. He said, "You told him the same thing 27 years ago." My father said I was trying to save him. Ivan said, "No, you were trying to save yourself." My father stepped toward him, and I moved between them. I asked Ivan what he meant. He said my father had made a promise to the thing in the woods. He had promised to bring me back when I was old enough to remember. I looked at my father. He did not deny it. Instead, he closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he looked like a man who had finally run out of ways to hide the truth. He said, "I made the promise because there was no other way to get you out." I asked what he had promised. He said, "I promised that when you were ready, I would bring you back to the place where you first heard it." I asked why he would ever agree to that. He said, "Because the first time you answered the voice, something followed you, and it would not stop until you returned." I asked what followed me. He said, "A part of it." I asked where it was, and he looked directly at me. He said, "Inside you." I felt my stomach drop. I told him that was impossible. He said I had spent 27 years believing it was impossible too. But he had seen the signs, he had watched me forget things, he had watched me dream about the campground. He had watched me wake up speaking in a voice that was not mine. I asked him why he never told me. He said, "Because every time I remembered, it came closer." I asked what happened when he died. He said he never died in the way I believed. I stared at him. He said the man who died in that hospital bed was not him. It was something wearing his memories. Something that had learned how to live inside my family. I asked who was in the bed. He said a copy, a shell, something that looked like him, because I needed to believe my father was still there. I asked if my mother knew. He said she knew enough, but not everything. I asked where the real him had been all those years. He looked toward the back of the church and said, "Here." I stared at him, then at the dark doorway behind the altar. He told me that he had been trapped between places, unable to leave because the thing had taken part of his memory. He said every time he tried to leave, it called him back using my voice. I asked why it would use my voice. He said, "Because you were the only person it could not imitate completely." I asked what that meant. He said when it tried to copy you, something was always missing, something human, something it could not understand. I asked what was missing. He said fear. I looked at Ivan, and he nodded. He said that was why it was afraid of me. I asked why I was not afraid, and Ivan said you were when you were 8, but then you learned how to make it afraid instead. I felt another memory pushing through, a memory of standing beside the old structure near the creek, my father holding my shoulders, telling me not to look into the darkness, and the darkness speaking in my own voice, asking me to come closer. I remembered being angry, not afraid, because I thought the voice was making fun of me. I remembered saying, "You are not me," and the entire forest had gone silent. I remembered something moving inside the darkness, something enormous bending toward me. And then I remembered hearing my father scream, "Run!" I remembered running toward the fire, but before I reached it, I had turned around, and I had looked directly at the thing. I still could not see its face, but I remembered what happened when it looked at me. It backed away. My father had pulled me into his arms, and he had whispered that I had to forget. I asked my father if that was when Ivan disappeared. He nodded. He said Ivan had been standing nearby, watching everything. I asked if Ivan had seen the thing. He said yes, and that was why it took him. I asked why it did not take me. My father said because it could not. I asked why, and he said because you had already changed it. I asked what I had changed, and he said you had given it something it had never had before. Fear. The word hung in the church, and for a moment nobody spoke. Then the floor beneath us cracked. One of the wooden boards lifted several inches, and a cold black mist came through the gap. Ivan immediately stepped backward. My father grabbed my arm and told me to move. I asked where. He pointed toward the old door behind the altar. We ran, but before we reached it, the church lights came on by themselves. Every light at once, even though there had been no electricity in the building. The brightness revealed hundreds of scratches covering the walls, names carved into the wood, names I recognized from the photographs, missing people, children, families. All of them had been written over and over, and beneath the names were dates, some decades old, some only a few months old. I saw one date from 3 years earlier, and beside it was my name. I stopped. My father pulled me forward, but I pointed toward the wall. He told me not to look. I asked why my name was there. He said because it had been waiting for me. I asked how long. He said since the first night. I asked if that meant it had known I would return. He said it had never stopped knowing. Then a voice came from the back of the church. It was my own voice, but younger. 8 years old, asking where my father was. I turned toward it, and there I was, standing at the end of the aisle, a small boy in wet clothes, barefoot, holding the blue cup. I stared at myself, unable to move. The child looked exactly like I remembered myself, except for one thing. His eyes were completely black. He smiled and said, "You finally came back." My father grabbed me and told me not to answer. But the child tilted his head and said, "You promised me." I asked what I had promised. The child said, "You promised that when you were old enough, you would open the door." I looked at my father. He was crying now, tears running down his face. And he said I had forgotten that part. I asked him what door. He pointed toward the floor, beneath the altar. The old wooden boards had begun to separate, and a narrow black opening had appeared underneath them. Something was breathing below, slow and deep, like the sound of a huge animal sleeping beneath the earth. The child version of me walked closer to the opening, still holding the cup, and said, "It has been waiting for you." I told him to stop. He smiled, then placed the cup on the floor beside the opening. And the moment the cup touched the wood, every voice in the church began speaking at once. My mother's voice, my father's voice, Ivan's voice, my own voice, hundreds of voices calling names, begging, laughing, crying, whispering, and beneath all of them was one voice that did not sound human at all. It spoke slowly, clearly, using my real name, and it said, "Come home." The floor collapsed beneath the altar. My father pushed me backward, even grabbed my hand, and the church shook so violently that dust fell from the ceiling. The opening widened, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. My father looked at me and said, "This is where it began." I asked what was down there. He said, "The part of you that never came back." Then he pushed me toward the staircase, and before I could ask what he meant, the church doors slammed shut, the lights went out, and something below us whispered in my own voice, "Welcome back." I stood at the top of the staircase, staring into the darkness below. I could hear something breathing beneath us, slow and deep, each breath followed by a faint vibration that traveled through the wooden steps and into my shoes. My father was standing behind me, one hand pressed against the wall, his face almost impossible to see in the darkness. Ivan was beside him, still holding my wrist. Neither of them moved, and for several seconds I wondered if either of them had actually heard what I had heard. "Welcome back." The voice had sounded exactly like mine, but it had come from somewhere far below. I asked my father what he meant when he said, "The part of me that never came back." He looked at me and said, "There was something you left down there when you were 8. I asked what it was. He said, "Your fear." I told him that made no sense. He said it would once I saw it. Then something moved beneath the staircase. The sound was not loud, but it was close, something dragging itself slowly across stone. I asked my father if we could leave. He said we could not. I asked why. He said because the church was already gone. I looked behind us. The room was still there, the benches, the walls, the doors. Everything looked exactly the same. But my father said the building we had entered was only the memory of the church. The real church had burned down 20 years ago. I asked how we could be standing inside a memory. He said because the thing beneath the mountain did not understand the difference between memory and reality. I looked at Ivan, and he said that was why people disappeared. They were not taken somewhere else. They were pulled into memories that no longer belonged to them. I asked if we were inside my memory now. He nodded. I asked whose memory the staircase belonged to, and he said yours. I looked down again. The darkness seemed to move slightly, as if something beneath us had heard him. My father told me that when I was 8 years old, I had gone down those stairs alone. I told him I had never seen them before. He said that was because he had spent 27 years making sure I would not remember them. I asked why I had gone down. He said because I heard someone calling me. I asked whose voice, and he said yours. I stared at him. He said the first voice you ever heard down there was your own. You were calling yourself from somewhere you could not see. I felt a pressure build behind my eyes. Then another memory surfaced. I remembered standing in the forest at night, holding the blue cup, hearing my own voice from inside the trees, asking me to come closer. I remembered walking toward it, my father running after me, and Ivan standing near the creek watching. I remembered stepping onto a narrow trail that did not exist during the day. The trees had seemed taller, the ground softer, and every few feet I had heard someone whispering my name. Then I remembered reaching a wooden door built into the side of the hill. There was no building around it, just a door standing alone between two trees. I remembered touching the handle, and the moment I did, someone whispered from the other side, "You left me here." I asked my father if that was the door. He nodded. I asked what was behind it. He said, "You." I told him that was impossible. He said it was the part of you that answered the voice, the part that wanted to know what was calling you. He said when you opened the door, something came through, and something else stayed behind. I asked what came through. He said the thing you are afraid of. I asked what stayed. He said the thing that was not afraid of it. I looked at Ivan. He said that was the child you became in the woods. I asked if the child standing in the church was real. He said no, not anymore. I asked what happened to him. Ivan said he became the door. The words made no sense, but before I could ask anything else, the breathing beneath us stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. My father whispered that it had heard us. Then the staircase creaked, one step below us. Then another. Something was coming up. My father told me to stay behind him, but Ivan pulled me toward the stairs. I asked what he was doing. He said we had to go down before it came up. I told him that was insane. He said if it reached the church first, we would never leave. I looked at my father, expecting him to stop Ivan, but he only nodded, and that was when I realized he had been waiting for this moment for years. We started down the stairs. Each step was covered with a thin layer of black moisture. The air became colder as we descended, and the smell of wet leaves grew stronger. The same smell from my childhood, the same smell from the campground, the same smell from the passenger seat of my car. Halfway down, I heard someone walking behind us. I turned. There was nothing there, but the sound continued, one step behind mine, always one step behind mine. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I moved again. They followed. I asked my father if he heard them. He said yes. I asked what they were. He said, "Do not give them a shape." I asked why. He said, "Because once you imagine what is following you, it becomes easier for it to become that thing." I kept my eyes forward, but the footsteps continued behind me. Sometimes they sounded like an adult, sometimes like a child, sometimes like my own shoes when I was 8 years old. After several minutes, we reached the bottom. There was a narrow passage ahead of us. The walls were made of packed earth and tangled roots. Small drops of water fell from the ceiling, and every few feet there were scratches in the dirt. Names, hundreds of names, some written normally, others backwards. I saw Ivan. I saw my father's name. I saw my mother's name. And then I saw mine, written again and again, each version in a different handwriting. I asked my father why my name was everywhere. He said, "Because the thing had been trying to learn how to write it." I asked why. He said, "Because it could speak your name, but it could never write it correctly." I looked closer. Every version was missing one letter. Always the same letter. I asked what letter was missing. My father said the first one. I felt another memory rise. I remembered my mother teaching me how to write my name. But every time I wrote the first letter, my father would erase it and tell me to start again. I had never understood why. Now I knew. He had been trying to make me forget the first letter of my own name. We continued through the passage. The walls began to change. The dirt became wood, then concrete, then stone, and suddenly we were walking through the campground. But not the campground as it looked now. This was the campground from 27 years ago. There were tents around us, cars parked along the road, people sitting beside fires, children running between the trees. Everything looked normal, except nobody seemed to notice us. I saw my father younger, standing beside the fire. I saw my mother sitting on a blanket, and I saw myself as a child, playing with the blue cup. I stopped. My father told me not to approach. I watched my younger self laugh. Then Ivan appeared beside him. The two boys looked at each other, and suddenly I remembered something I had forgotten completely. Ivan and I had met before that night. He had been at the campground for several days. We had played together. We had explored the creek, and he had shown me the old door in the hill. I remembered asking him what was behind it, and he had told me there was another campground underneath ours, one where everyone who disappeared was still living. I remembered laughing, because I thought he was trying to scare me. Then he told me he had heard someone calling his name from the door. I asked what the voice said. He said it promised to show him where his parents had gone. I remembered telling him we should open it together. My stomach tightened, because I finally understood. I had not called Ivan into the woods by accident. I had convinced him to follow me. I had been the one who opened the door, and when the thing spoke from inside, I had answered. The memory continued. My younger self opened the door, Ivan stood beside me, and my father came running through the trees, shouting for us to stop. But it was already too late. Something came through the doorway. Not a body, not a creature, but a darkness that moved against the wind. It wrapped itself around Ivan first, and he screamed. I remembered reaching for him, but my father pulled me away. Ivan disappeared into the darkness, and the door slammed shut. Then the thing looked at me, and it spoke in my voice. It said, "You called him, so you have to come back for him." The memory faded, and I was standing in the underground passage again. My father was crying quietly. I asked him why he never told me. He said, "Because you were 8, and because the truth would have destroyed you." I asked him what happened after Ivan disappeared. He said he took me away, but before he could leave, I looked back at the door and said something. I asked what I said. He said, "You told the thing that you would come back." I felt sick. I asked if that was the promise. He nodded. I asked why it waited 27 years. He said, "Because it knew you would forget, and it knew your memory would eventually return." I looked at Ivan. He was standing several feet away, watching me. I asked him why he had stayed all these years. He said, "Because someone had to remember the way out." I asked if he could leave with us. He shook his head. He said only one person could leave. I asked who. He said, "You." I told him I would not leave him again. He smiled sadly and said, "You already did." Then the passage behind us filled with darkness. My father grabbed my shoulder, telling me to run. We moved deeper into the underground tunnel, and behind us I heard footsteps, dozens of them. Then hundreds, children, adults, people calling my name, people crying, people begging me to turn around. I kept running until I saw a faint light ahead. It was the old door from my childhood, standing alone at the end of the passage, the same door I had opened 27 years earlier. My father stopped. He told me that if I opened it again, there would be no forgetting afterward. I asked what was on the other side. He said, "Everything you left behind." I reached for the handle. Then I heard Ivan's voice behind me. He said, "Do not open it until you understand why it was afraid of you." I looked back, and Ivan was gone. My father was gone too. The passage was empty. The footsteps had stopped. I was alone with the door. I placed my hand on the handle, and from the other side I heard my own voice whisper, "If you open this door, you will finally remember what you really are." I kept my hand on the door handle and listened to the voice on the other side. "If you open this door, you will finally remember what you really are." I did not move. The words were spoken in my own voice, but there was something underneath them that did not belong to me. Something cold and patient. Something that sounded as if it had been waiting for this exact moment for 27 years. I looked down at my hand. The skin around my fingers had gone pale from gripping the handle so tightly, and for the first time since I had returned to the campground, I realized I was not afraid of what was behind the door. I was afraid of what I might remember. I asked the voice what I was. There was a pause, then it answered, "You are the one who opened the door." I closed my eyes, and another memory came back. I was 8 years old again, standing beside Ivan in the rain, my father running toward us, shouting for me to stop. But I was laughing, not because I was happy, but because I had heard something beautiful coming from the darkness. It sounded like my mother singing, the same song she used to sing when I was sick, and I believed she was behind the door. I had reached for the handle. Ivan had grabbed my arm, telling me not to do it. But I told him she was waiting for us. He asked how I knew, and I told him she had called my name. Then I remembered something that had never made sense before. My mother had not been at the campground that night. She had been home. My father had left her there, and yet the voice had sounded exactly like her. I remembered opening the door. I remembered the darkness spilling across the ground, and I remembered Even screaming. My father reached me a second later and pulled me backward. But the darkness had already touched my hand. I remembered looking down and seeing something black moving beneath my skin, like ink spreading through water. I screamed. My father grabbed my wrist and held it against his chest, and he said my name over and over. But the voice from the doorway repeated it louder, until the entire forest seemed to be speaking through him. Then I remembered Even standing in front of me, his face covered in rain, telling me not to listen. He said it was lying. He said there was nobody behind the door. But I did not believe him. I told him the voice knew my mother. And he said it knew everyone. That was how it got inside people. It used the voices they trusted most. Then the darkness moved toward him. I reached for him, but my father pulled me away and Even disappeared. I remembered screaming his name until my throat hurt. And then I remembered looking back at the door. The darkness had stopped, it was waiting, and somehow I understood that it wanted me to come after him. I told it I would. I told it I would come back when I was older. And that was the promise. The memory ended, and I opened my eyes. My hand was still on the handle. But now I understood what my father had meant. I had not been protecting the thing from myself. I had been protecting myself from the part of me that could hear it. I had always thought the voices were calling me because they wanted me. But that was not true. They were calling me because I could answer. And when I answered, they became real. I turned the handle. The door opened inward, and there was no darkness behind it. There was a forest, bright sunlight, warm summer air, birds singing, and the smell of fresh grass. For a moment, I thought I had opened the wrong door. Then I saw the campground. 12 sites around the loop road, tents everywhere, cars parked beside the trees, people talking near the fires, children running between the picnic tables. It was the campground from 27 years ago. I stepped through, and the door disappeared behind me. I looked around for my father, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then I heard a child laughing near Site 7. I walked toward the sound, and there was Ivan, sitting on the picnic table with the blue cup in his hands. He looked exactly as he had before he disappeared, 8 years old, wet hair, red jacket, dirt on his shoes. He looked at me and smiled. I asked him if he remembered me. He said, "I never forgot you." I asked him where my father was. He pointed toward the trees. I followed his hand, and I saw my father standing beside the creek. Younger than I remembered him. He was looking toward me, but he did not seem surprised to see me. He said, "You came back." I asked him if this was real. He said it was real enough. I asked him if I could take Even home. My father looked at him, then at me, and said, "You cannot take him home." I asked why. He said because he is not the one who disappeared. I stared at Even, then back at my father. I asked what he meant. My father said the boy you remember disappearing was taken by the thing. But the boy standing beside you is the memory it kept. I asked where the real Even was. My father looked toward the trees and said he is still waiting. I felt a cold pressure behind my eyes, and suddenly I could hear dozens of voices coming from the forest. Every voice belonged to someone I had known, my mother, my father, my aunt, old friends, people I had forgotten, all calling my name. I asked my father what I was supposed to do. He said, "You already know." I told him I did not. He said, "You have to call him back." I asked who. He said, "Ivan." I asked how. He said, "The same way you called him the first time." I refused. I told him I would not open another door. He said, "You do not need to open one. You only need to remember the sound of your own voice when you were 8. I stood there beside the creek, trying to remember. Then I heard it, my childhood voice calling from somewhere deep in the trees. "Even, come back." I froze. The voice came again. "Even, come back." And this time I realized it was not coming from the forest. It was coming from me. I looked down at my hands, and the black mark beneath my skin had returned, spreading slowly across my palm. My father told me to keep speaking. I called Ivan's name again, and the campground changed. The sunlight disappeared. The trees became taller. The people around the fires vanished, and the ground beneath my feet became wet mud. I could hear footsteps coming toward me, slow footsteps. Then Ivan appeared between the trees. Not the child beside the picnic table, but the real Ivan, older now, his face pale, his red jacket torn and covered in dirt. He looked at me and said, "You finally remembered." I told him I was sorry. He said, "You were 8. I told him I should have listened. He said, "You did listen. That was the problem." I asked him what happened to him after the door opened. He said he had been inside the place where all the voices went. He said there were no days there, no nights, no distance, only memories. He said he had watched me grow up through other people's memories. He had watched my father search for ways to keep me safe. He had watched my mother cry whenever she heard my name. And he had watched the thing learn how to imitate all of them. I asked why it wanted me. He said, "Because you were the first person who made it afraid." I asked how I had done that. He said, "When you were 8, you looked at it and told it that it was not real, and for the first time something inside the darkness had become uncertain. It had spent decades trying to understand what made you different." I asked what made me different. He said you could hear the voices without becoming them. I asked if that was why it could never copy me completely. He nodded. Then, he said, "But now that you remember, it will try one last time." I asked what would happen if it succeeded. He said it would leave this place using your face. I looked toward the trees, and I saw something standing there, far away, wearing my clothes. It was the shape of me, the height of me, the way I stood, but its face was hidden by shadow. I felt my heart begin to pound. Even told me not to look at it for too long, but I could not stop. The figure began walking toward us, slowly, one step at a time. My father grabbed my shoulder and told me to leave. I asked where. He pointed toward the campground road. He said, "Keep walking until you see the ranger station. Do not look back. Do not answer anyone who calls you. And do not stop until you reach the other side." I asked what would happen to him. He said, "I have been waiting for this moment too." I asked what he meant, and he smiled, then walked toward the approaching figure. I watched my father disappear into the trees. The figure stopped, and for 1 second I saw its face. It was mine. But the eyes were completely black. It smiled. And my father's voice came from its mouth, telling me to come home. I turned away and started walking. I did not run, because I remembered the rule my father had taught me when I was 8. If you hear me calling you from the woods, make sure you can see me before you answer. I kept walking. The campground began to change around me. The tents disappeared. The road became empty. The trees became younger, then older, then nothing but shadows. I heard voices calling from every direction. Some sounded angry, some sounded frightened, some sounded like people begging me to help them. But I did not answer. Then I heard my own voice behind me, saying, "Wait." I stopped for half a second, but I did not turn around. The voice said, "Please, it is me. You left me here." I kept walking. Then the voice became the voice of my father. He said, "I am proud of you." I almost turned, but I remembered his face in the church. I remembered the tears in his eyes. And I knew that if it were really him, he would never ask me to turn around. I kept walking. Eventually the trees opened, and I saw the ranger station, the same building where the woman had laughed when I asked about a reservation. Only now the windows were dark. The door was open, and there was nobody inside. I stepped onto the porch, and behind me the forest went completely silent. I looked at the ground. The blue cup was sitting beside my shoe. I had left it in the church, but somehow it had followed me. I picked it up, turned it over, and saw the faded word even underneath. Beneath it was another name, my name, but this time the first letter was visible. I understood what my father had spent his life trying to erase. And I finally remembered the name I had been given before I was old enough to speak. The name the thing had been calling for 27 years. I whispered it once, and the forest answered, not with my voice, but with thousands of voices repeating it together. Then everything stopped. I stood there listening, and for the first time there was no fear in me, only exhaustion. I looked toward the road and saw a car approaching, headlights cutting through the darkness. The car stopped beside the ranger station, and a woman stepped out. She looked at me for several seconds, then asked if I was lost. I almost laughed. I told her no. She asked if I had been camping. I said yes. She looked at the blue cup in my hand, and her face changed. She asked where I found it. I told her at Site 7. She stepped backward, then asked me what year it was. I told her, and she stared at me as if I had said something impossible. She said Site 7 had been closed for 27 years. I asked why. She said because a boy disappeared there. I looked at her and asked his name. She said Evan. I nodded. Then she asked me something that made my blood run cold. She asked if I had heard anyone calling my name. I looked toward the trees, and for just a second I saw my father standing among them. He raised one hand, not calling me closer, but waving goodbye. Then he disappeared. I turned back toward the woman, and she was staring at me, waiting for an answer. I told her yes. I had heard someone calling my name. She asked, "Who?" I looked down at the blue cup, and for the first time I understood why my father had never wanted me to remember. Because the voice had never been trying to lure me into the woods. It had been trying to get out. I told the woman that I had heard my own voice. She looked toward the forest, and her face went completely pale. Then she whispered something I could barely hear. I asked her to repeat it. She said that was impossible. I asked why, and she pointed behind me. I turned slowly. There was a second version of me standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. The same face, the same clothes, the same eyes, except this time they were not black. They were mine, completely human, and the thing smiled at me from the darkness. Then it whispered my childhood name, the name I had forgotten for 27 years, and I realized the door had never been meant to keep it inside. It had been meant to keep me out. I looked down at the blue cup one final time, and there was a new line written beneath our names. I remember you. I dropped the cup, and somewhere deep inside the forest, a child laughed. Then another voice called my name, and this time it came from the empty campsite.